Welcome to Shadowed Tales Archive. Tonight, we invite you to descend into darkness with a chilling anthology of horror stories, each one inspired by true events. This is episode 20. Let the nightmare begin. The Rain Caller. It was almost 3 o'clock in the morning when something woke Emily Carter up. She stayed in bed for a few groggy minutes, warm beneath the familiar blankets. For the last 3 days, an enormous rainstorm had been falling on the island of Kauai, bringing an unusual chill along with it. The rain smacked against the window panes relentlessly. Emily had grown used to its noise, so it was something else that had disturbed her, and she knew she'd never get back to sleep until she figured out exactly what it was. With a reluctant sigh, she sat up in bed and looked around. The light. Her bedroom was filled with strange shadows and a stark light she hadn't recognized right away. The new security light Ryan, her brother-in-law, had put in for her just before the storm. Nobody had come by, and Emily had done a thorough job of making sure she had enough supplies to last out the bad weather. She'd never seen it switch on at night before. It was probably the wind pushing something into the garden that had triggered it. The system was supposed to shut itself off after 3 minutes. She wondered how long she'd been awake and watched the clock tick 1 minute after another. 4, then 5. The light stayed on. Ryan wasn't known for his amazing skills at electrical installation. Under normal circumstances, Emily would have insisted on hiring a professional, but she didn't really see the point of having the security to begin with. She'd only agreed to it to make her sister happy. There weren't many dangers in rural parts of the island, unless you were afraid of having to listen to hippies talk about carving gourds. Emily's nearest neighbors were a 15-minute drive away, and that's how she liked it. She didn't even have a paved driveway. Who, she wondered, would bother to go all the way out to her place to commit a crime? It was smarter to head to the coast and wreck up the big town. She cursed and grumbled as she got out of bed, shivering in her shorts and long-sleeved tee. It was even colder than she thought it would be. The floor was like ice beneath her bare feet. She stepped quick and lightly to the window, hugging herself for warmth, and tried to crane her head to see where the security light was mounted. The rain was making a mess of her view, coming down in thick streaks that made the outside world look like it was twisting around in a crystal decanter. A shape moved at the corner of her eye. Her heart pounded for a second or two, then calmed as she looked into her driveway. Standing a little ways to the side of her car was a figure. It looked like a girl with bright red hair, pinned up in the style of a surf bunny from the days of Frankie and Annette. She was wearing a long, floral print dress and standing right in the middle of the pouring rain. She was too far away, and the weather was too bad for Emily to make out her features. As she watched, the girl in the driveway looked right up at the bedroom window and waved. A slow, robotic hello. The tiny hairs on Emily's arms stood up, and she ducked away from the window. She took a few deep breaths. Fine. The girl was there because her car had broken down, or she had some other kind of trouble. And she knew that somebody was home because Emily's car was right there beside her, or maybe she assumed that somebody had manually turned the outside light on. But how could she have known exactly where Emily was? The room was dark, the security light was too bright and distracting, and there were other windows on the second floor. How had she known exactly which one Emily was standing at? Calming herself, telling herself there was probably an innocent explanation for it all, Emily glanced out the window again. The girl was still there, waiting. She looked young and delicate, like a teenager. There were all kinds of warnings and emergency procedures being declared because of the storm, and 2 of the nearby roads were flooded. Emily knew she'd never forgive herself if that girl was in need of help, and she left her stranded. Shaking the doubts from her mind, Emily decided to make her way downstairs. She tried not to think of the girl's eerie wave. She tried to rationalize the strangeness of the shadows. Both the car and the small palm tree had cast long, deep shadows from the stark white light on top of the lanai. The girl didn't have any shadow at all, but that could have been something to do with the angle or a trick of the rain. The weather had blurred so many details, it was hard for Emily to be sure of anything she saw. Just as her foot touched the bottom stair, the sound of the knock filled the house. A rhythmic slamming against the front door, in no way gentle or persuasive. It was loud, startlingly so, and strangely hollow. An angry demand, very unlike the way Emily would have expected the girl she saw to knock. She tried to tell herself that her nerves were skewing things, making her edgy when there was no need to be. Maybe it had been a loud knock because the girl was feeling desperate, wanted to be sure that the people inside heard her. But then, why hadn't she used the doorbell instead? Maybe there was someone else with her, and Emily simply hadn't been able to see them from the window. That changed things. That was a rational concern. What if there was a boyfriend? Someone big, strong, and threatening. Emily hurried into the kitchen and got herself a knife. Nothing big or menacing like one of the butcher's knives on the posters for horror movies. Just a small paring knife. Very sharp. The kind of thing that was guaranteed to hurt a man if you wanted him hurt, or stop him if he needed stopping. For the first time since moving out of the city, she regretted the seclusion she'd chosen. She'd take all the airplane flyovers, traffic noise, and petty crime in the world to feel less vulnerable. The knock sounded again, with such urgency that Emily could feel the vibrations of it inside her bones. She made herself think of flooded roads, stranded people, medical emergencies. With the knife at her side, she went to her front door and stood with her hand resting on the knob. Part of her was screaming to forget it, to go back upstairs and lock herself in her room until morning, but she couldn't. In a quick, defiant motion, she swung the front door open and looked out into the pouring rain. No one was there. "Hello," Emily called, stepping carefully onto the lanai. "Is somebody out here? Do you need help?" She made her way forward very carefully, adjusting her grip on the knife handle. The rain was fierce and deafening, cold splashes of it coiling around her naked ankles like ocean spray. Everything smelled drowned and muddy. There was no sign of anyone, not even a set of footprints in the softened earth of the driveway. Emily stepped to the very edge of the outside steps and took one last look around. "I'm going back inside," she called, her voice quivering more than she would have liked. As she turned, the front door slammed shut and shook the floor of the lanai. The security light snapped off so quickly, it was as if the bulb had suddenly burnt out. Emily sprang towards a closed door and twisted frantically at the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Impossible. The only way to lock the door was from the outside. She hadn't even had a deadbolt put in. Finally, the door relented and swung open as though there hadn't been any resistance at all. Emily dashed inside and slammed it shut behind her. The house felt empty and full at the same time. The grayness of the rainy night settled on the familiar rooms in front of her like a layer of dust. She knew that the house had to be searched. Somebody could have been hiding close to the wall and ducked in when she was looking at the driveway. It took her a few moments, standing in the empty front room with the soft drumbeat of the rain mingling with the pounding of her heart, before she felt bold enough to do it. When she found no one, she began to relax. She ended the search in the kitchen and decided to pour herself a glass of water and check her phone. Just to be safe, she'd send a message to her sister. Nothing to worry her, just something to let her know about the girl in the driveway. She put the paring knife down on the counter and picked up her phone. No bars and no Wi-Fi. The storm had been upsetting service on and off for the last few days. Emily tried not to think of it as isolation. It was just a nuisance. Her imagination was playing tricks on her. When morning came, she would laugh at herself and spend another cozy day curled up and watching whatever was saved on the DVR. A razor-thin breeze whistled by her ear when she went to get a glass from the cupboard. There was a sound like nothing she'd heard before. A sharp, reverberating thud. Something had hit the cupboard door while she held it open. Slowly, nervously, she closed it to see what it had been. The paring knife was sticking out of the door as though it had been thrown. Emily turned. The kitchen was bright, well lit, and empty. She grabbed the phone off the counter and hurried upstairs to the bedroom. She would throw on some flip-flops and proper clothes, grab her keys, and get the hell out. The goat ranch up the road was owned by two very friendly retirees. She was certain that they would help her. There was no guarantee that the roads would be clear, probably covered in water and debris, maybe even a fallen tree, some parts too muddy to drive on, but she had to try. Her feet almost slipped on the hardwood stairs as she hurried to change. Nothing dramatic, just enough to feel like she wasn't driving through a rainstorm in her underwear. She grabbed a pair of jeans off the closet floor and pulled them on, her back to the window. As she did, the room filled with the pale white light that had woken her up less than an hour before. The security light coming to life once more. She didn't want to turn around and look out the window, but she made her body move to where she could look out and see. There was no red-headed girl, but the light stayed on. Calmly, Emily slipped on her flip-flops and headed into the hall. She breathed steadily, stepped carefully. The house was colder than it should have been at the top of the stairs. The smell of rain and boggy, wet earth was pungent and overwhelming. Emily swallowed hard, steadied herself. It would be a difficult drive to the neighbors. She wouldn't make it if she was in a panic. But when she got to the middle of the staircase, she couldn't control the surge of dread that overtook her. The front door was wide open. The security light caught the falling rain, casting patterned shadows on the floor. Emily braced herself and headed straight for the door. She would run right for the car and jump in, without any kind of hesitation. She made for the lanai, but something at the corner of her eye, in the dust-gray shadows of the living room, moved. Emily froze. She couldn't help herself. She turned to look. The red-headed girl was standing there, her head tilted to one side. This close, Emily could notice things she hadn't been able to see from the upstairs window. Like the black dirt under the girl's fingernails, the disarray of the orderly hairstyle, the rips and stains on the long floral dress. "I'm sorry." The girl looked over her shoulder, as though she were expecting someone else to step out of the shadows behind her. The security light switched off. The Shadows of Room 9. This story is based off of real events that happened to me and my family while on our second vacation to Scotland. Names might be changed to keep our privacy, and some details might be wrong. But for the rest, everything is what happened. Oh, and we all survived Winky Face. Liam, my parents dragged me towards the pillar where the tour guide would meet us. It was the second day of our 2-week vacation to Scotland, and right now, we were in the capital city of Edinburgh. Our hotel had given us a few tips and things to visit overnight, and eventually, the three of us decided that we would go to the Meerkat Ghost Tour in the Edinburgh dungeons. Exciting for the entire family, was what the hotel owner had said. In all honesty, I wasn't such a fan of ghost stories. I didn't like horror at all. Actually, it was definitely not my favorite, nor could I take jump scares. So I wasn't that happy. My heart was pounding quite fast, and if I were to see even the slightest scary thing, like a spider, I'd probably jump in my father's arms to hide. No shame, I'm a scaredy cat. It had gotten pretty late, and we were waiting at a small cafe with a nice view on the Meerkat Pillar. Eventually, the tour guide arrived together with a German family of 4. The tour guide introduced himself, and we started walking through the city. Edinburgh was beautiful. It was a pretty old city with a big history. The guide stopped every now and then at a building and told us an interesting story before continuing on walking. The German family took pictures of everything while me and Mom listened carefully. Dad was taking pictures as well. We walked around the plaza called the Edinburgh Mile, and after walking for a while, we reached a small street, nearly hidden from the public. It was barely visible, and we stopped to look around a bit. We were surrounded by houses and flats, 3 high each. The tour guide opened his bag and searched for the key to the building he'd take us in. After a while, he found it. He opened the door and gestured us to enter. The guide grabbed a lantern and started walking down some stairs. We followed him down the cellar-like stairs, and the door closed shut behind us. Shivers ran down my spine as it was getting colder as the night grew older. Also because we went lower and lower underground. I looked over my shoulder at the door and nearly bumped into my father because we came to a sudden stop. The guide turned around and creepily looked at us. The dungeons appear to be discovered quite recently. They have been closed off and forgotten due to the criminal world seeking refuge and dealing in the underground. The government wanted none of it, and thus they closed it. Years passed, and the dungeons got forgotten. At least until recently, when someone found them by accident at the construction site of some building. Meerkat took the opportunity to make it into the ghost tour it was now. There were prop bodies and lights hidden throughout the dungeon, and if you listened carefully, you could hear scary music playing in the distance. The guide focused his attention on us and started telling stories. I wasn't completely there though, I was distracted. I felt cold and somehow unsafe. I wanted to get out, even though there was nothing to worry about. I sought comfort in my mother's arms and tried to listen to the guide, but there was something or someone ominous around. I didn't feel secure. It was as if we were being watched from behind. We continued and got even deeper inside the dungeons as the guide took us to a closed-off section of the dungeons. It had been found by the workers of Meerkat while cleaning out and preparing the dungeons for their tours. Apparently, it was the safe route from the Edinburgh Castle to the outside world. The route had been forgotten and hidden for ages until they found it. Story goes that 2 of the castle's guards accidentally blew up the tunnel by firing the cannon, which indicated 1 o'clock at 1 a.m. instead of p.m. after having 1 or 2 beers too much. It fell off the wall and boom. Anyway, the tunnel was now closed off for visitors. Have I told you the story of Room 9? Asked the tour guide. We all shook our heads, indicating he indeed hadn't. Very well. The guard put down the lantern on a rock and started his story. Again, shivers ran down my spine, followed by a feeling of dread. I felt scared, anxious, but not unsafe. Not anymore. A long time ago, there was this hotel. Everybody forgot its name, location, and city, but it's around the city of St. Andrews. The story goes the hotel had a haunted room, number 9. Of course, the room hadn't always been haunted. It started in the 16th century. On a late autumn night, a young lady appeared at the hotel. She seemed cold and looked for a room to stay the night. The hotel owner had 1 free room, number 9. The girl thanked him and immediately went upstairs to sleep for the night. The next morning, the girl wasn't awake for breakfast. She hadn't come down for lunch either. Even though every guest needs their privacy, the hotel owner was getting worried that something had happened to the girl. The man walked up the stairs and knocked on the room door. He waited for an answer, but it stayed awfully quiet. He knocked on the door again, this time a bit louder. Still no answer. The man was getting very worried about the mysterious female now, so he decided to grab the spare room key and unlock the door. The man walked down the stairs again, but as he went down to grab the key, he heard eerie whispers in his ear. He couldn't understand what they were saying, something about a man clothed in all black. This scared the old man. He grabbed the key to room number 9 and held it tight in his sweaty hands. He ran back up the stairs and knocked on the door one more time. No answer. He unlocked the door and turned the doorknob to the right. He carefully pushed open the door and called, "Miss? Excuse me, are you there?" He took a quick peek around the half-open door, but couldn't see the bed yet. He now opened the door fully and walked in. On the bed, covered in a red pool of blood, the corpse of a mysterious female had been left for dead, murdered in cold blood. On the ceiling of the room was written help in the woman's blood. The old man gasped in fear and called for the town guards. To this day, nobody knows who murdered the girl. The hotel owner couldn't handle the feeling of guilt and closed the hotel for good. It wasn't until 50 years later when a young family bought the empty house. There were way too many rooms for them, so they decided it would be a good idea to make it into a hotel. So they did. But as the husband of the family inspected every single room, he found one room with a strange, scary atmosphere. He didn't feel safe at all in the room. He could swear he heard whispers in the room, telling him about a man clothed in black and murder. He shivered and shut the door. He numbered it room 9 and decided to never rent the room. The family earned good money off of the room, but never ever let anyone rent room 9. The family got rich off of their hotel and the fantastic service, but never ever did they rent room 9. It turned spring to summer, autumn, and winter again. But the winter was harsh and cold. Chances of surviving without food or a roof above your head were near to null. Every room in the hotel was full, except for room number 9. The weather outside was harsh. It was snowing and the wind was sharp. It was close to midnight, and the family's husband was sitting in the bar drinking his final beer before closing the hotel door. Suddenly, he could hear a weak knocking on the door. He grabbed a torch and opened the door. He looked straight into the eyes of a young woman and her child. They seemed very tired and cold. They were soaking wet of the snow and freezing. If he didn't let them in, they would surely freeze to death. The husband had pledged to never let anyone stay in room 9, but decided it was better to let them stay than letting them freeze to death. He let the woman in, who thanked him dearly. He handed her the key to room 9 and shut the door. The woman and daughter went up the stairs and stayed the night in room 9. The husband went to his room and tried to sleep, but he couldn't. His heart was pounding in fear, yet he didn't know why. An hour passed, and the man still couldn't fall asleep when suddenly he heard a loud screech. It sounded like it was from a woman. He lit a candle and ran up the stairs. Every hotel guest had awoken from their slumber by the loud scream, and everyone was looking out of their room doors to see what had happened. Everyone but room 9. The hotel owner was shaking from head to toe as he opened the door to room 9. He walked inside and saw the woman sitting on a chair in the middle of the room, her eyes fixed on the ceiling in fear. She was completely terrified and paralyzed in fear. The daughter was lying dead on the floor. The husband knew that he had made a mistake. Rumors spread across the country like wildfire, and soon the entire nation knew about the hotel and the haunted room. The husband was never renting the room ever again, not even when it was freezing outside. He pledged it against his wife, his son, his grandmother, and everybody else. Never. Anyway, years passed, and the hotel grew famous worldwide for its haunted room. Word reached the Vatican, and a monk wanted to hear nothing of it. He thought it was all the biggest humbug, and he was going to prove it with his own life. The monk traveled all the way to Scotland, to the hotel, just to prove it was all a hoax. The monk sought contact with the hotel owner, and after discussing for a long while, the hotel owner decided to let the monk stay for one night, and one night only. The monk took his belongings inside the room, and the owner gave him 2 bells. One huge bell, which he could ring if he was in trouble. Dong it would sound, and a small bell, for if he needed something to eat or drink. Ding it would sound. Night fell over the city, and the family's husband stayed awake for the night, scared of what might happen to the monk. For hours he waited, but nothing happened. The hotel owner's eyes grew heavy, and he nearly fell asleep. Maybe he even did, until he got awoken by the sound of a bell. Ding, ding, ding. It was the small bell being ringed over and over again. It got quicker and quicker, so the husband slowly made his way up the stairs. Suddenly, the big bell rang. Dong! It sounded through the entire hotel. The husband now ran up the stairs and opened the room as quickly as he could. In the middle of the room, the monk was sitting in a chair, his eyes fixated on the ceiling in fear. In his hands, the small bell. In the corner of the room, the big bell. Way too far for him to have been able to ring it. The hotel owners were now certain of the room being haunted by the mysterious woman who had been murdered there ages ago. The hotel closed. The room numbers disappeared. Nobody knows what and where is nowadays. Have a good night. The tour guide let us out of the dungeon, and we walked to the hotel together, still in shock of the finishing story as told by the guide. It was quite an amazing experience, yet we wouldn't want to do it again. Way too scary, especially so late at night. We arrived at our hotel and stayed the night. The day after, we drove from Edinburgh to Crail. Crail was a small fishing village located near Isle of May, famous for its huge population of puffins. We arrived at the hotel where we would stay the night. After walking around for the entire day, we made our way to the hotel and met up with the hotel owner. The year before, we'd been there as well, and the man still remembered us. He was very nice and kind and loved whiskey, just like every real Scot. He told us stories about when he was younger. The owner took us to our room, which he had reserved especially for us. It was a big room with a nice view on the sea. Strangely enough, it had no number on the door. I suddenly got a flashback of the year before, when we stayed here as well. We were having breakfast and got in a conversation with a man and woman who had stayed the night in a room with no number. They'd had some weird experiences in the room. The woman woke up in the middle of the night because she felt something next to her, but her husband was gone. The bed was empty. Somehow, the husband had gone walking in his sleep and found his way to the stairs next to the bathroom. That's at least what they told. Anyway, the owner gave us the key and walked back downstairs with us. After more stories and folklore, he went to bed and we were left alone. It was getting midnight and the three of us decided to play a card game called Last Card Plus. My father had always been the more skeptical of us three when it came to ghosts. He didn't really believe in them. As we played the game, he started telling jokes about the tour yesterday. Neither Mom nor I liked it, since we did believe in ghosts. But whatever, we finished the first of 7 rounds. Mom won. Dad and I had to count the score of our leftover cards. I had 6 points and Mom wrote it down. I looked at Dad, who had a weird grin on his face. He showed me his cards, and I looked at the score of the cards together. 17. Mom and I glanced at each other and laughed nervously. But the second round ended with Dad having 17 points. Again, his smile disappeared. At the third round, his smile was completely gone, and at the end we counted our leftover points again. Dad's face had turned white now. 17 points, 3 times in a row. And at that moment the lights went out. Voices in Hollow. It was late into July when we decided to visit a place from our past. This would be one of the final nights we would all spend together as friends. There were 5 of us, and we were soon to be going our separate ways. Derek and I would be starting our college degrees in the fall, him across the state in East Tennessee, and I in Missouri. Simon and Nina were a package deal. They were juniors and had been dating on and off since elementary school, for all the good that did them. They were oftentimes arguing, but always seemed to make up one way or another. Finally, there was Lena. She was 2 years younger than us, and the first week of August she was moving across the country. Her father was a software developer, and after decades of struggling, he was offered a job by some promising startup company in Silicon Valley. The week before Lena was supposed to move, she asked us to go out to the field and forest right off Old Union Road. It was a strange request coming from Lena. She was never the one to suggest we hang out there, but she was always happy to accompany us, and considering the accident she had in the forest nearby, it was stranger still. Perhaps it was for the sake of nostalgia. We had grown up in those woods, playing in that field. There was no way we'd pass up one last chance to be kids together. We arrived at sunset. I parked my car at the top of the hill not far off the road. The field sloped down gradually until it ended at the edge of the thick forest. We spread out our blankets and laid out to stare at the heavens above us. After a couple hours, a lull in our conversation allowed my mind to wander. I turned my head and my eyes caught sight of the trees through the twilight. I began thinking about what lay beyond that tree line. The initial outset of the forest was dense. A small path designed for a 4-wheeler or mule cut along the surface and followed the tree line. There was no seeable path deeper into the forest without traveling by foot. Many large trees had collapsed either near or across the path from time to time. The caretakers of the land would often drive through and clear the path, moving the large trees to the side. Over the years, the buildup of fallen debris had created a barrier reinforced by gnarled branches, saplings, and bramble bushes. It wasn't worth the effort trying to get a motorized vehicle over the mound, so we always traveled by foot once we got as deep as the path would allow. Besides, we knew it was pointless, as not much farther in was a narrow creek that cut deep into the earth. The easiest way across was a well-timed jump. Otherwise, it was a laborious descent down into ankle-deep water and a messy climb out. The trees of the forest become sparse once further in. That's when you knew you were almost there. The small trees gave way to ancient oaks and pines that towered over the forest. The shrubs and bushes were mostly gone, and the ground was covered in moss, vines, and dead leaves. Barely visible was a large ridge in the distance, at least 25 feet high. Originally, a railroad lay on the top of that ridge and cut through these woods, ending in town, but that was many decades ago. Now the track was all but gone. A few ties were left behind, but the metal had been recycled into scrap, or so we thought. The railroad wasn't the most interesting part of the forest, however. It was what was at the base of the ridge, a small junkyard, or more appropriately, a dump spot. It wasn't uncommon to find these places around the more rural parts of the county. You see, the railroad eventually intersected a road many more miles down to the east. The ridge was just wide enough for a truck to travel down, and although it was a very slow drive, it was much faster than driving across the county to the landfill. To the west, the track eventually ended in overgrowth deep into the forest. The ridge sloped down at a near sheer drop. Some small trees sprouted up from out of the side, but nothing of any substantial growth. The only tree of any size that grew in the junkyard was at the bottom and dead center amongst the morass. The maple was still pretty young by the standards of the trees around it, but its bark was strangely dark, much darker than any other tree I had ever seen in the forest. At the base, all manner of garbage could be found. Anything ranging from soda cans to an entire washing machine that was half embedded in the dirt. Radiating out from the ridge, the junkyard formed a semicircle. It occurred to me that the structure of the junkyard was planned. At one point many summers ago, we had found the intersection and followed it all the way in. From up above, the uncanniness of the semicircle could be seen. That same adventure ended with Lena falling down a lesser part of the incline and spending a few weeks in the hospital. It wouldn't be the last time we visited that place, but an unease about the junkyard would always remain etched into our minds. We all knew these woods well. We spent hours upon hours hanging out at the junkyard, just being naive juveniles, until, of course, Lena's fall. We never really went back to the rubble. She had become frightened of the area, and most times it was enough just getting her past the creek. I remember it had been a couple years since I had seen the familiar rubble, but I caught a glimpse of it one late afternoon while we were trekking through. A pang of nostalgia struck me. Lena urged us to turn back, so we complied. Someone shifting on the blanket brought me back into the present. My eyes broke from the trees and returned to the stars. There we were, 5 of us laying out in the field. The forest was not far in front of us, and behind us, the nearest house was almost too far away to see except a small prick of light cutting across the tall grass. Faintly off in the distance, I heard the familiar sounds of coyotes barking and howling deep in the woods. It was always an unsettling sound to me, but this time was even stranger. The cacophony continued for quite some time. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something else was permeating the sounds of the coyotes, something slightly higher pitched and reminiscent of a bird. Cue, 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 kyuk, followed by a series of clicking noises. I seemed to be the only one that heard it first. The coyote calls continued for a few more minutes, and then the strange sound happened again. "What the hell was that?" asked Lena. I quickly replied, "I heard it too, but earlier. I think it's been happening since the coyotes started." "I think it's some kind of bird," said Simon unconvincingly. Through the darkness, I could see his eyes shining. Apprehension scrawled across his face. "Well, I think it's time we went back and put on a movie. I'm bored." But his voice betrayed him and cracked on the last word. As we shuffled to stand and gather the blankets, we heard a rushing sound in the tall grass behind us. Something had cut across between us and the car. Was it a coyote? I had never come face to face with a wild animal, especially a scavenger desperate enough to attack 5 of us. That's when I heard the rushing coming from a different angle. It cut across our path again, and all I could see was the tall grass waving in the moonlight. We were all frozen in fear. Had it been the same animal or another? Almost in answer, the rustling happened again, but this time from two different points. They came to a halt in front of us. We were still at least 50 yards away from the car. The pack of coyotes had circled around the field and cut us off. There was no way we could make it. Some weird urge suddenly came to me. I felt exposed. I needed to get out of that field. The forest, I croaked in a whisper. My chest was tight, and I could feel the familiar pangs of heart palpitations incurred by my anxiety. I hadn't blinked since the second rush. As my eyes flashed closed, I heard the rustle in front of us move forward and come to a stop. I was taken off guard and stumbled backwards. One of the girls let out a short cry. The sudden movement must have startled the animals in the grass as everything around us began moving and rustling. The dread set in completely now. We were surrounded in a wide arc with the forest as our only retreat. I quickly stood back up when suddenly everything stopped. The light breeze ceased, the grass slowed, the silence enveloped us. And for a moment, I thought I had gone deaf, but I was reassured by the sound of blood pumping through my ears. Kyuk. The shrill cry pierced the silence. It was right in front of us. The animals in the grass were making these noises. Another responded from our left, and then another clicked multiple times from our right. Go, I said exasperatedly. Simon spun and sprinted for the forest line, and we were all following close behind. As we approached the black towering trees, I could hear the quick footfalls of an animal running parallel to me. I could even hear its labored breathing as it raced across the field with us. I lost control of my voice, and I let out a guttural scream just as we entered into the darkness of the forest. We passed through the first line of trees and ran perpendicularly across the mule trail. My shins slammed into something hard, and I felt myself falling. I crashed into a pile of logs and debris that were built up on the side of the path. The wind was forced out of my lungs, and I clawed at the bark trying to drag myself over. Something warm wrapped around my wrist and arm and pulled hard. I slid over trees and rolled down the other side. It was Derek. He had pulled me over, and I could barely make out his face, but he had his index finger to his mouth. The other three had disappeared deeper into the woods. I heard something stirring back behind us at the tree line. I quietly rolled over and laid on my stomach to see over the barrier. Black four-legged figures paced back and forth in the moonlight. They had stopped at the tree lean. Long fur hung off the creatures, but something was odd about the way it moved. There wasn't a strong wind that night, but the fur moved back and forth like tendrils. These things that were hunting us were not coyotes. Where are the others? I whispered barely audibly. Derek grabbed my shoulder and motioned for us to keep moving into the woods. I turned back to look at the creatures at the tree line. One slowly entered into the shadow of the canopy. It was wheezing and panting in strange, uneven breaths. It kind of hopped forward and stopped on the mule trail. My eyes got bigger as more of the animals entered the forest. Derek tugged at my shoulder, and I began pulling myself up. I placed my hand on a branch, and I immediately knew it was dry and brittle. But before I could stop myself from applying my weight, I felt the branch give way. A loud crack echoed briefly, and the creatures chortled their strange sound and rushed into the woods. We were sprinting again. It wasn't much farther before we hit the creek, and I knew in this darkness and at this speed I was sure to miss the jump. Falling in would give the creatures enough time to catch up to us. Derek was only a few feet ahead, and very quickly I saw him leap. I estimated and leaped as well. The ground didn't come up to meet me. Instead, I continued to fall. I landed and my feet sank into mud up to my knees. The summer heat had mostly dried the creek up. All that was left was a soft sludge along the bottom. I looked around, and Derek was down there with me. He was laying prostrate. I didn't have time to check if he was alive or dead. I laid in the mud as the rustling of the animals behind us grew louder. They were right on top of us. We were dead. We were dead, and no one knew it. How long would we be missing before anyone came looking? Would they even find our bodies? The first creature to arrive at the bank leaped over and continued running. Then 2 or 3 more. Or was it 4? How many of these things were there? As their panting and rustling dissipated, I reached out for Derek. His head was facing the opposite direction, and I couldn't make out if he was breathing in the darkness. My legs were still stuck, and he was outside of my grasp. I stretched and writhed in the mud. When my finger brushed his arm, he recoiled violently. His head spun around to meet my own. He grabbed my arm once again and pulled. I could feel my legs coming free, but the suction of the mud ripped the shoes from my feet. "Are they gone?" he asked. I had to lean down and nearly place my ear against his lips to hear his words. There was a quiver in his voice that made it difficult to completely understand him. "We have to go back and get help." "What about the others?" But my question was only met with horrified eyes, waiting for the only thing he wanted to hear. A confirmation that we would leave the forest, that we would be safe. I couldn't do that for him. Despite the overwhelming desire to flee, I couldn't leave my friends in this hell. It would be nearly 2 hours before we could get help out here. I shook my head, not really convinced I was making the right choice. A short whimper escaped Derek's lips, and he stood. The forest had grown unnervingly quiet. I hoisted myself up and stood where the mud wouldn't suck me down again. Derek turned towards the bank in the direction of the car. "I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry," he whispered and began climbing using twisted roots as steps. I did the same, but only on the opposite side. "Derek, you cannot leave us here. Get to the car, lock the doors, wait for us. Do not leave us," I said as loud as I dare in hopes that I wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Derek did not respond. Once we had both climbed out of the ditch, I looked around toward the tree line. Only a few slivers of moonlight on the field could be seen if I looked at just the right angle. We were ways in, but it was deeper still to the junkyard. Calm momentarily crept over me as once again memories of past summers flashed through my mind's eye. If my friends had gone anywhere, it was there. Derek had his back to me, but I knew exactly what he was doing, calculating the fastest way out of the forest. A human shriek cut through the forest, and like a gunshot at a race, Derek bolted away from me. But it was a short-lived escape. He made it only about 5 feet before he stopped and made a choking sound like he had been hit in the throat. His hands shot up to his neck, grabbing at something I couldn't see in the darkness. His head jerked up, and he was quickly lifted into the trees with his arms flailing and his legs kicking. The scream that issued from him sounded like it was being pushed through his clenched jaws. "Coo, coo, 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 coo." It came from above, and multiple other calls responded, followed by a sea of clicking. The creatures were in the limbs of the trees. How had it grabbed Derek and pulled him up and so high? They were medium-sized animals, nothing larger than a Labrador, and yet Derek was gone, pulled into the blackness like a doll. His scream suddenly ended, and I could hear the sound of liquid drizzling down into the branches and grass like rain running off a clogged gutter. I twisted around and sprinted through the dense trees, small saplings tearing at my face and brambles attempting to snag me and bring me to the ground. Every time I brushed against a larger limb, I pulled away, afraid that dark, unseen hands were reaching out to grab me and pull me into the branches. Tears were streaming down my face, and my chest was tighter than it ever had been before. It was like some enormous rubber band had been wrapped around me, and with each passing second it squeezed just a bit tighter. My breath was coming in short bursts, and I could feel my vision becoming hazy. Of all the times to have a panic attack, this was both the worst and most fitting moment. I pressed on for what seemed to be far too long. I should have reached the junkyard by now. I was exhausted. Pain from running had begun to form in my lower abdomen, and my speed was decreasing. I could feel my steps becoming sloppy, but finally I noticed the forest had become thinner. A bramble wrapped across my ankles succeeded in tripping me up. I stumbled forward and fell to my knees. My hands came down hard on a rock and something sharp. I knew immediately I was bleeding. I was still hyperventilating, and my vision was blurred from the tears. My hearing was diminished by the rushing of blood through my ears. I couldn't make out if any of the monsters had resumed their chase. My hands probed the rock. It was smooth, incredibly smooth, except for a patch that felt like sandpaper that flaked off as my fingers ran over it. I quickly wiped my eyes and brought my face down low. It was a half-buried washing machine, partly rusted, but mostly still covered in smooth white painted metal. My breathing began to come under control. That's when I heard the sobbing. I stood up quickly, reeling from being lightheaded, but I pushed through the rubble and into the semicircle. I tried to speak, but only a croaked moan came out. Lena screamed through her sobs. My eyes locked on her. She was sitting in the middle of the rubble with someone laying beside her. Lena? Oh my God, thank God. Are you all right? She didn't respond. She only continued to cry. When I reached her, it was like she hadn't noticed me. She was holding Simon in her arms. His eyes were closed. I reached out and placed my hand on her shoulder. She jerked, released Simon, and flailed. Her arms and hands struck my face, my chest, my arms. I bit back the pain and pulled her into an embrace. He's dead. He died only a few minutes ago. Nina was pulled down by the dogs. But they aren't dogs, are they? Are they? She was still hysterical, but at least she was also coherent. No, I don't know what they are. Her face raised up and our eyes met. The moonlight danced off her tears. Their fur, it moves like hair underwater. And their hooks. Hooks. I hadn't noticed any hooks on the creatures when I saw them at the tree lean. The ones in the trees. They have these long arms that reach down, and their hands are large hooks like what you hang meat on. She began to tremble violently. As we ran, Nina fell behind. She doesn't know these woods like we do. She called to us, but I was too afraid to look back. Lena was crying harder now. I heard her scream, and then those things I knew they had gotten her. It was only a few more feet before Simon caught his side on something just under his armpit. He was pulled into the air and flipped sideways. He fell, and I grabbed him. I don't know why I stopped for him, but I saw it. Chills ran down my body. My arms and legs pricked up in goosebumps. I couldn't look away from Lena. She had regained some composure, but her eyes were hard. Why? I began but was cut off. It was covered in that black wavy fur. As it climbed down, I could see its arms were incredibly long, and where its hands should be were two hooks. It got so close to us. I couldn't tell where its head ended and its body began. And its eyes? There were so many, like a spider, glossy red in the light. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. My mind kept replaying the moment Derek died. How his head snapped back and that terrible scream he loosed. One of the creatures must have caught him in the throat or under his jaw. It was almost like these things were fishing for their prey. We managed to make it here, Lena continued. Simon was still alive for a while. He was bleeding so much. I couldn't stop it. There was so much. All he kept asking me was if Nina and I were fine. Oh God, Eli, what is going on? Her eyes finally broke from mine, and she stared down at Simon, who I could see was pale from blood loss. The moon shining down gave him an ethereal quality. I didn't have the answers. I doubt anyone did. I suddenly became painfully aware of the silence that had been present since my arrival to the dump. Have you heard them since you came inside the junkyard? Lena didn't respond. God damn it, Lena. Have you heard them? Her head snapped back to mine, and for a moment all there was in the forest, in this entire universe, was her face. Kyuk. The pain of my heart skipping pierced through my chest. For the first time since I had arrived, I noticed Lena had been leaning against the one tree in the center of junkyard. It was the maple with the darkest bark in the forest, and the animal call had come from directly above us. The rapid clicking of the creature filled my ears as I slowly looked up and met its glossy red eyes staring back at me. The rapid clicking of the creature filled my ears as I slowly looked up and met its glossy red eyes staring back at me. I stood quickly and grabbed Lena's hand. We ran through the debris and past the tree, never once looking back. Branches and sharp pieces of scrap tore at our clothing. I didn't know where I was going, only that we had to get away from that tree. Behind us, I could hear the sound of rustling limbs and the bark of the maple being torn away. The thing had dropped from the branches and was in pursuit. We hit the trail again, this time from the opposite side, and sprinted down the small hill towards the creek. I didn't know how far the others had made it, or if this was the same place we had crossed before. I just knew the creek would slow it down. We were only a few feet from the edge when Lena slipped. I went down with her. The soft moss-covered dirt offered no grip. We both tumbled down and into the mud. It was thicker here. The water was higher, maybe due to a spring nearby, or maybe because this area hadn't dried as fast. I grabbed Lena and lifted her up. She was drenched and shivering. We climbed out together and scrambled through the trees. The sound behind us had stopped. I turned my head to see if the creature had followed, but there was nothing. Nothing behind us. Nothing in the trees. No sound at all. We had exited the junkyard, and we were alone again. I collapsed against a tree, breathing heavily. Lena sat next to me and cried quietly. We had no idea how much time had passed. The moon was still up, but everything else was still. It didn't feel right. We didn't speak for a long time. Eventually, we gathered enough strength to walk. It was slow at first. I kept stopping to listen, but there were no sounds. We were both barefoot, bruised and bloodied. The cold of the night was beginning to sink in. Lena walked with a limp and was holding her side. I kept looking at the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Eventually, we found the edge of the woods. In the distance, I could see the car. It was still sitting at the top of the hill. The blankets were scattered near the field, and there was no sign of Derek. The feeling that had taken root in my chest was starting to sprout into something darker. I looked at Lena, and she met my gaze. We both knew what we were thinking. We moved slowly through the tall grass, keeping our heads low and ears tuned for the familiar clicking. Nothing. When we reached the car, I unlocked it and helped Lena into the back seat. I climbed into the driver's side and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. There was no rush of relief, no wave of safety. I started the engine, and the sound broke the silence like glass. We drove away from the woods and didn't look back. We didn't say a word the entire ride. When I pulled into Lena's driveway, her parents came out of the house. They were frantic and confused. I got out of the car and collapsed on the grass. I couldn't even explain what had happened. Paramedics were called, and so were the police. Lena was taken to the hospital. I was taken home. I spent the next few days in a blur. I was questioned by the police repeatedly. They searched the woods. They found the field and the blankets. They even found the junkyard. They never found the bodies. No sign of Derek, Simon, or Nina. Lena refused to speak to anyone about what happened. She told the police that we were attacked by animals and had to run. They didn't believe her. They didn't believe me. No one did. Our town held vigils. News crews ran stories. People searched for weeks. Eventually, the search ended. People moved on. They said it was a tragedy, a freak accident. But I knew better. So did Lena. We still talk sometimes. Not often. There isn't much to say. She lives on the West Coast now. She's different. So am I. There's a piece of us still in those woods, buried with our friends. I think about going back sometimes, to find answers, to make sense of it all. But I never do. I don't think I ever will. Sometimes when the night is quiet and the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it. Cue, 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 and the clicking. Always the clicking. The shadows of Morham Street. This story comes from my friend Aaron, and he was around 18 at the time of this particular incident. It was summertime, so he went visiting relatives in a city called Morham. His maternal family was based there, living in a few houses in a small cluster. A few of his cousins and one of his uncles, Uncle Theo, who was also quite young, being around 25 at the time, also joined him there. During their stay, they heard a few stories of a house their family owned. It was located 2 houses down the street and was unoccupied at the time. Its only utility was that the courtyard, which was open to the sky, was used as a gym of sorts by the local bodybuilders during the daytime. One of the stories they were told was that of a local bodybuilder named Rafik. Rafik was alone lifting weights there one day, and one time after getting up to stretch after lifting something particularly heavy, he was patted on the back and told, "Well done." Only, he knew there was no one else in the room. He had stopped being there alone after that. Aaron and his uncle were quite excited after hearing all that, and being young and foolish, they decided to spend night there. They were warned against it, a few of the elders, including their maternal grandfather, Mr. Whitmore, calling them fools for meddling in things you do not understand, but their minds were set. In the end, they decided that they would enter the house after dark, a little before midnight, and sleep there, leaving just after daybreak. Since the house was not in use, they decided to sleep on the roof on charpais, which is a traditional woven bed in the Indian subcontinent. They also instructed their watchmen to lock the main door after they had entered to ensure no one else could enter after them, and to come open the door immediately after daybreak. Apparently, the watchman laughed after hearing this and told them he would keep the key ready because they would be calling him long before that. The next night, before they were supposed to go to the house, one of their elders told them to try something. He told them to set up a carom board in the courtyard and just leave it there, untouched, and check it sometime after. They set it up in the house as instructed and carried their charpais to the roof after that. It was difficult doing all of it in the dark, since the house did not have an electric supply. Their only source of light was an oil lantern, and the light it cast was dim and yellow, but they were still happy for the lack of ghost sightings. They spent the first hour playing cards, and nothing seemed to happen. Much more relaxed about the house, they began to wonder what everyone was on about. And then, during one of the rounds, they heard the unmistakable sound of the hand pump in the courtyard being worked and the sound of water flowing. They were 4 floors up, on the roof, but that sound still sent a shiver through them. They tried to ignore it the best they could, but the hand pump continued pumping water on its own. Much quieter now, they tried to keep playing cards, but around 1 a.m., they just gave up and decided to sleep instead. Aaron slept on one of the charpais on the edge and slept like a rock till he was woken up by someone shaking him. He got up to the frightened face of one of his cousins. He pointed to Uncle Theo, who had been sleeping in his boxers on the far edge. It was then that he noticed that he seemed to be writhing in pain, clutching his throat. They tried to shake him awake, but it took a whole minute filled with the fear of what was happening to wake him up. Uncle Theo woke up, breathing heavily and still clutching his throat. He looked at them and said, "We need to leave this place now." "It is 3 a.m. already," one of the other cousins said. "We only need to wait an hour or so more, and then I want to leave this place now, and I will jump from the roof to do that if I have to." They were even more frightened after that. They decided to leave, but remembered that the house entrance was still locked. So, they started shouting to get the watchman's attention. Soon enough, though, they got the attention of Aaron's grandfather instead, Mr. Whitmore, who had been sleeping on the roof of his house anticipating something of the sort. After a few choice curses, he sent for the watchman and told them that he would be waiting for them downstairs. They still had to climb down the stairs, though. For flights of stairs, in pitch-black darkness, with nothing but the dim light of the lantern to guide them. They climbed down slowly and with much arguing about who would climb down first and who would be at the rear. They kept their eyes nearly shut and tried not to look around them, since they kept imagining things in the dark, looking back at them, or perhaps one of them being dragged off. And Uncle Theo was still clutching his throat, the image of him writhing still fresh in all of their heads. When they finally got to the courtyard, they went past the carom board, and all of them noticed that all the pieces were now in the pockets. When they finally got to the door, the watchman was waiting for them with a large smile on his face. "So, are all you young ones done here? Has your warm blood run cold yet?" he said, laughing at them. After they were out of the house, they asked Uncle Theo what had happened, but he refused to tell them anything till he was out of the darkness. So they took him to a street lamp, and they sat under it till he calmed down and stopped shivering with fear. And then he told them his story. "As I fell asleep, I dreamt that I was in the house. I walked down to the courtyard, and in my dream, I started urinating there. Just then, an old man with a long beard and terrifying eyes came and grabbed me by the throat. He shouted, "How dare you defile this sacred place?" and lifted me up in the air with one hand. I was helpless, kicking and gasping for air when all of you woke me. After he told them the story, he finally took his hands off his throat. Even in the lamplight, they could clearly see the bloody blue mark of a hand right across his neck. The Hollow Rider. I used to live in Cambridge a while back, which is a small city smack in the middle of England, best known for the university that is as large as the city itself. But I was there for work. I had a few friends around the city, and Cambridge being a very green city, it is the Cambridge way to cycle around in most places. I would mostly visit my friends in the evenings, and we would all stay up till late. Not socializing or drinking, but playing games, musing philosophically, and finding other means of continuing our existence. On the nights this continued for particularly long, I would have to cycle back halfway across the city, often in cold. This was usually quite pleasant. Cambridge is quite a safe city, and I generally enjoy being out in the dark, alone, under the yellow of the nightlights. It was one of those nights, though, that I met what felt to me like the devil himself. It was on another one of those long, quiet, lamplit roads on a particularly chilly February night. I was halfway home and slightly wary of it being 3 a.m. This was late even by my standards, and this put me somewhat on edge. My senses seemed to be more alert than usual, and I was unconsciously keeping an eye on every single shadow on the street, trying to avoid as many alcohol-fueled incidents as I could. As I turned into a street that told me I was not very far from where my apartment was located, I started to feel much more peaceful. It was halfway across the street, biking in my leisure, that I noticed a man in a dark jacket cycling around 20 feet in front of me. My senses suddenly sharpened again, due to the simple fact of him seeming to appear out of nowhere. Perhaps I had not been paying as much attention as I thought I was. The man was cycling quite slowly, and even while barely pedaling, I slowly started to draw near him. It also started to get quieter on the street. It took me a few moments to realize that I could not hear the man's bike or the many mechanical clicking sounds my bike often made. The quiet was eerie. That should have warned me, but not heeding what now seems like a very obvious warning, I kept cycling closer to the man. I found his speed quite peculiar, even more so than his dark attire, and so as I drew nearly level, I glanced at his body. I say his body because his face was not very human. It was made of what can only be described as a shadow, and with eyes that seemed like the very depths of hell itself. One look left me lifeless, motionless, speechless, riding down the slope right next to him, too scared to move, too scared to act. And worst of all, I was unable to take my eyes off his. Part 2. "This way is closed," he said, in a growling voice that made my hair stand on end. "This way is closed. Go back." That was all he said, but with those words to hold his eyes, its eyes had over me was broken. I managed to find some life in my hands, and I braked as hard as I could, letting him get ahead of me. He continued to cycle ahead at his eerily slow pace, and then, as mysteriously as he had appeared in front of me, he was gone. He simply disappeared, unhurriedly, into the shadows at the end of the street. The rest of the way back home for me was a fight against my own body. My mind would not stop reeling from the horror it had just experienced, and my heart was in my throat, unwilling to go down. I could not think. I could not rationalize. I had no refuge. I could hear again. I could hear the wind in my ears, the clunking of my pedal as I cycled as fast as I could. And unfortunately for me, I could hear someone riding a bike a little behind me. When I finally got home, I threw my bike and rushed into my first-floor apartment, refusing to look at what was surely there. I could still hear footsteps following me up the stairs, but I refused to acknowledge them as I rushed into my room as fast as I could and into the refuge of my bed. I could still see shadows under my front door as I finally decided to go to bed. They refuse to go away. True story from 3:49 a.m., 25th of February, 2012.
And that was tonight's tale from the Shadowed Tales archive. If it left a mark on your mind, if the silence feels heavier now, then the story did what it was meant to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the darkness. New stories are always on their way. Until then, keep the lights low and the doors locked.